The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, crisp and official, bearing the law firm's embossed letterhead that I'd seen countless times before. But this time, something was different. The notary's handwriting in the corner caught my eye, a small notation that shouldn't have been there. Witness discrepancy. See attached. My hands trembled as I opened it, expecting routine estate paperwork. Instead, I discovered that my parents had quietly rewritten their entire will 6 months ago, cutting me out completely while giving everything to my brother Marcus. But it was the notary's private note that made my blood run cold. Client appeared coerced, unusual circumstances documented. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sophia Chen, and for 28 years, I believed I was the daughter my parents could count on. While Marcus partied through college on their dime, I worked 2 jobs to pay my own way through law school. While he bounced between failed business ventures, I built a successful practice and bought the house next door to care for them as they aged. While he disappeared for months at a time, only surfacing when he needed money, I drove Mom to every doctor's appointment and helped Dad organize his medications. I thought love was measured in presence, in sacrifice, in the small daily acts that no one else saw. I was wrong. The morning that changed everything started like any other. I was reviewing contracts in my home office when Mrs. Patterson from next door knocked on my door, holding the mail that had been delivered to the wrong address. Among the usual bills and advertisements was that envelope from Morrison and Associates, the law firm that had handled our family's legal matters for decades. I knew the letterhead well. I'd been there countless times with my parents, helping them navigate property transfers, tax documents, and what I thought were routine will updates. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, stuffed with more documents than a simple notification would require. I settled into my kitchen with a cup of coffee, expecting perhaps news about the trust fund modifications we'd discussed months ago. My parents had always been transparent about their estate planning, or so I believed. They'd told me repeatedly that they wanted to ensure both Marcus and I were taken care of, though they worried about his spending habits and poor financial decisions. The first document was standard legal language, the kind I'd parsed through countless times in my own practice. But as I read deeper, the words began to blur together in disbelief. Last will and testament of Robert and Helen Chen, revisions dated 6 months prior. And then the devastating line that made my coffee cup slip from my hands. To our son, Marcus Chen, we leave the entirety of our estate, including the family home, all financial assets, and personal property, trusting in his judgment to honor family obligations. To Sophia Chen, our daughter, we leave our regrets for the pain she has caused this family through her selfish actions and manipulation of our trust. I read it 3 times before the words sank in. Selfish actions, manipulation. These were descriptions of someone I didn't recognize, certainly not myself. But it was the notary's handwritten note paper-clipped to the back that made my stomach drop entirely. The note was written in careful script. Mr. and Mrs. Chen appeared distressed during signing. Mrs. Chen asked twice if this was really necessary and seemed reluctant. Mr. Chen appeared agitated, mentioned evidence his son had provided. Both clients seemed uncomfortable with content. Unusual circumstances warrant documentation per professional protocol. Contact me directly with any questions. Eleanor Vasquez, licensed notary public. I stared at that note until the letters seemed to dance on the page. Evidence? What evidence could Marcus possibly have provided? And why would a notary feel compelled to document unusual circumstances unless something was seriously wrong? My phone buzzed with a text message, and my heart jumped when I saw it was from Mom. "Can you come over? We need to talk. It's important." The timestamp showed she'd sent it 20 minutes ago, right around the time I would have been opening the envelope. The timing felt deliberate, calculated. Did she know I'd received the documents today? I drove the short distance to my childhood home with my mind racing. The familiar driveway, the garden I'd helped plant last spring, the ramp I'd had installed when Dad's arthritis made the front steps difficult. Everything looked the same, but somehow felt foreign now. How do you confront the people who raised you about what feels like the ultimate betrayal? Mom answered the door before I could knock, her face drawn and eyes red-rimmed. She looked older than I'd ever seen her, fragile in a way that made my anger falter momentarily. But then I remembered the words in that will, the accusation of manipulation, and my resolve hardened. "Sophia, honey, come in. Your father's in the living room." Her voice carried a weight I'd never heard before, heavy with something that sounded almost like shame. She couldn't meet my eyes as she led me through the hallway lined with family photos, images of birthday parties, graduations, holidays that now felt like lies. Dad was sitting in his recliner, the one I'd researched and bought for his back problems, staring out the window at the backyard where we'd spent countless weekends together working on projects. He looked up when I entered, and I saw something flicker across his face. Guilt, maybe, or fear. "Dad, Mom," I began, pulling the envelope from my purse. I set the documents on the coffee table between us, the papers crisp and damning in the afternoon light streaming through the windows. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Mom sank into her chair, hands twisted in her lap, while Dad's jaw tightened in a way I remembered from my teenage years when I'd stayed out past curfew. But this felt different. This felt like the moment when everything you thought you knew about your life reveals itself to be built on sand. "We can explain," Mom finally whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. "I'm hoping you can," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "Because according to this, I've apparently been manipulating and causing pain to this family. I'd love to know when that started, since I seem to have missed it entirely." Dad cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "Marcus came to us 3 months ago with some concerning information. He showed us things, Sophia, things that made us realize we didn't know you as well as we thought." "What kind of things?" The question came out sharper than I intended, but I was past caring about tone. "What could he possibly have shown you that would make you believe I was manipulating you?" Mom pulled a tissue from the box beside her chair, dabbing at her eyes. "The recordings, sweetheart. He had recordings of you, talking about us, about how you were just waiting for us to die so you could inherit everything, how you were only taking care of us to secure your financial future." The room seemed to tilt.
Recordings? I had never said anything remotely like that to anyone, ever. The very thought was repulsive to me. "That's impossible. I never said anything like that. I would never." "He played them for us," Dad interrupted, his voice growing stronger with what sounded like practiced conviction. "Clear as day. You were talking to someone about how you'd moved next door as an investment in your inheritance, how you were playing the good daughter role while Marcus was too honest to pretend." I felt like I was falling through space. The accusation was so far from reality that I couldn't even process how to defend against it. "Dad, that never happened. I've never had that conversation with anyone because I've never felt that way. Moving here, taking care of you both, it was never about money. It was about love." "People can be very convincing, Sophia," Mom said softly, but there was something in her tone that suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as me. "Marcus said you'd deny it, that you'd become very good at manipulation over the years." The perfect setup. Deny the accusation, and it proves you're manipulative. Accept it, and you're guilty. Marcus had trapped me in a logic circle that left no room for truth. But something in Mom's hesitation, in the way she couldn't quite meet my eyes, told me she wasn't entirely convinced by his evidence. "Where are these recordings?" I asked. "If they exist, I'd like to hear them." Dad and Mom exchanged a glance that lasted several seconds too long. "Marcus has them," Dad finally said. "He said he'd keep them safe in case we ever doubted our decision." Of course he did. Convenient that the evidence wasn't available for examination, especially from someone with legal training who might recognize fabricated audio. I'd seen cases where family members had created fake evidence to manipulate inheritance disputes. The technology was easier to access than most people realized. "And the notary mentioned that you both seemed uncomfortable during the signing," I continued, pulling out Eleanor Vasquez's note. "She was concerned enough to document it officially." Mom's face went pale when she saw the handwritten note. Dad's hands clenched on the arms of his chair. The reaction told me everything I needed to know about the validity of their comfort with this decision. We were upset, Mom admitted quietly. It's not easy to cut off your own daughter, even when you feel you have to. But you felt you had to based on recordings you can't produce, provided by the son who's been financially irresponsible his entire adult life and who stands to gain everything from my exclusion? The logic was so clear it was painful, but I could see in their faces that they were committed to this path, whether from genuine belief or from fear of admitting they'd been deceived. Either way, the result was the same. 28 years of love, sacrifice, and presence had been erased by whatever story Marcus had spun. Your brother loves this family, Dad said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. My brother loves this family's money, I corrected. When was the last time he visited when he didn't need something? When did he last help with a doctor's appointment or a household repair or anything that required effort without immediate reward? The questions hung in the air unanswered because we all knew the truth. Marcus's presence in their lives was transactional, appearing when he needed financial help and disappearing once he'd gotten it. But somehow his absence had been reframed as honesty, while my presence had been recast as manipulation. I stood up, gathering the documents from the coffee table. I need some time to process this, but I want you both to think very carefully about what you've done here. You've chosen to believe the worst possible interpretation of every kind thing I've ever done for you, based on evidence you can't even examine, provided by someone whose motives should be obvious. As I walked toward the door, Mom called out softly, "Sophia, we never wanted it to come to this." I turned back to look at them both. These people who had raised me, loved me, taught me right from wrong. They looked small and fragile in that moment, and I realized they were probably victims in this too. Marcus had played them as expertly as he'd played every situation throughout his life. No, Mom, you never wanted to have to choose between your children, but Marcus made sure you felt like you had to, and you chose the child who told you what you feared might be true, rather than the one who showed you what actually was true every single day. The drive home was a blur. I sat in my driveway for 20 minutes, staring at the house I'd bought specifically to be close to them, wondering if every sacrifice I'd made had somehow been twisted into evidence of selfishness. The legal mind in me was already analyzing the situation, looking for angles and approaches, but the daughter in me was simply broken. That evening, I called Eleanor Vasquez, the notary who'd left the note. Her voice was professional but warm when I explained who I was and why I was calling. "I was hoping you'd contact me," she said immediately. "That signing has been bothering me for months. In 20 years of notary work, I've rarely felt compelled to document unusual circumstances, but something about that day felt wrong. Can you tell me more about what you observed?" Eleanor's voice dropped slightly, taking on the tone of someone sharing sensitive information. "Your parents seemed genuinely distressed. Your mother kept asking if there wasn't another way to handle the situation. Your father was agitated, kept mentioning proof and evidence, but he seemed angry rather than sad about having to make this decision. It felt like they were being pressured rather than making a free choice." "Did my brother attend the signing?" "He was there, yes. Waited in the lobby during the actual ceremony, but he drove them there and was going to drive them home. He seemed very invested in the outcome, kept asking if everything was finalized, if there were any other steps needed." The picture was becoming clearer. Marcus had orchestrated not just the content of the will change, but the entire experience, ensuring he maintained control throughout the process and that my parents felt isolated in their decision-making. "Ms. Vasquez, in your professional opinion, did my parents seem mentally competent to make this decision?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Competent, yes, but free from undue influence? That's much harder to say." "Your mother seemed particularly conflicted. She mentioned several times that you'd been nothing but helpful and loving, but that your brother had shown them evidence of your true feelings. It felt like she was trying to reconcile two completely different versions of reality." After I hung up, I sat in my quiet house thinking about two different versions of reality.
In one version, I was the manipulative daughter who'd spent years pretending to care while secretly waiting for my inheritance. In the other version, I was the loving daughter who'd sacrificed her own convenience and resources to care for aging parents while her brother exploited their generosity. The truth should have been obvious from the evidence of our actions over the years, but Marcus had understood something I'd missed. People are more inclined to believe their fears than their experiences, especially when those fears are presented as hidden truth revealed. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and I stared at it for several rings before deciding to answer. Whatever game he was playing, it was time to understand the rules. Sophia! His voice was cheerful, as if nothing had changed between us. Mom said you stopped by today. I hope they explained everything clearly. The casual tone, a pretense of normalcy, made my anger flare hotter than any shouting would have. Oh, they explained your version of events very clearly. Fascinating stories about recordings that conveniently can't be produced. His laugh was light, dismissive. I know this is hard for you to accept, but sometimes people aren't who we think they are, even family. You're absolutely right about that. There was a pause, as if he was trying to determine whether I'd just agreed with him or threatened him. Look, this doesn't have to change our relationship. You're still my sister. We can still be close. Marcus, let me ask you something. Do you actually believe the things you told them about me, or do you just not care that they're lies? Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its false friendliness. I think you've gotten very comfortable being the golden child, and you don't handle competition well. But Mom and Dad deserve to know the truth about your motivations. My motivations for what? Taking care of them? Being present? Sacrificing my own convenience for their well-being? Your motivations for positioning yourself as the primary beneficiary while making me look irresponsible. And there it was. The real complaint wasn't about my behavior toward our parents. It was about the natural consequences of his own choices. Years of financial irresponsibility, broken promises, and selfish decisions had created a situation where our parents trusted me more than him. Rather than changing his behavior, he'd chosen to change their perception of mine. I never had to make you look irresponsible, Marcus. Your actions spoke for themselves, just like mine did. But apparently, you're more persuasive than reality. Reality is subjective, Sophia, and our parents' reality now include a clearer picture of who you really are. The call ended, and I sat in the growing darkness of my living room, processing the casual cruelty of that last statement. Marcus hadn't just stolen my inheritance, he'd stolen my parents' love and trust. He'd rewritten the story of our entire family, casting himself as the honest truth-teller and me as the manipulative deceiver. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated both my legal training and my determination to uncover the truth. If there were recordings, they were fabricated. If there was evidence of manipulation, it pointed to him, not me. And if there was a way to expose his deception, I would find it. The war for my family's truth was just beginning, and Marcus had no idea what he'd awakened in me. For years, I'd been the peacekeeper, the caregiver, the one who smoothed over conflicts and made everyone comfortable. But that version of me had apparently been erased from their memory anyway. It was time to show them who I really was when pushed beyond endurance. And unlike Marcus, I wouldn't need to fabricate evidence to prove my case. The next morning, I began building my strategy with the methodical precision that had made me successful in law. I started with a simple timeline, documenting every interaction, every financial transaction, every moment of care I'd provided over the past 5 years. Bank records showing my payments for home improvements and medical expenses, email chains coordinating doctor's appointments, text messages about grocery runs and medication pickups. The evidence of my actual character was overwhelming once compiled systematically. Then I researched Marcus's financial history, using legal databases available to me through my practice. What I found was even worse than I'd suspected. He'd defaulted on 3 business loans in the past 2 years. His credit score was devastating. He'd been evicted twice for non-payment of rent, And most damning of all, he'd recently been turned down for a substantial loan that would have required parental cosigners. The timeline became clear. Marcus had needed money, approached our parents for help, been refused due to his track record, and then created a scenario where he could access their entire estate rather than just a loan. It was brilliant in its manipulation and horrifying in its betrayal. But the recordings remained the key evidence. If I could prove they were fabricated, everything else would unravel. I started researching audio forensics experts, professionals who could analyze digital recordings for signs of manipulation. I also began documenting every conversation I'd had in the past year, reaching out to friends and colleagues to ask if they remembered any discussions about my parents. What I discovered was illuminating. Every person I'd talked to about my parents remembered conversations focused on concern for their health, frustration with Marcus's irresponsibility, and love for my family. No one could recall me ever expressing anything resembling the sentiments Marcus claimed to have recorded. Several friends specifically remembered me saying, I didn't care about inheritance because I'd rather have my parents healthy and present for as long as possible. The contrast between Marcus's alleged evidence and the testimony of people who actually knew me was stark. But I needed more than character witnesses. I needed to expose the recordings themselves. That's when I remembered something that made my blood run cold. 3 months ago, around the time Marcus claimed to have discovered my true nature, he'd visited me unexpectedly. I'd been on the phone with my colleague Jennifer, discussing a difficult client case. The client was an elderly man whose children were fighting over his estate while he was still alive, and I'd expressed frustration about families who prioritized money over relationships. I'd said something like, "It's disgusting how some people just wait around for their parents to die so they can inherit. I'm grateful my parents are healthy because I'd rather have them than their money." Jennifer had agreed, and we'd talked about how sad it was when families were destroyed by greed.
But Marcus had been in my kitchen during that call. He could have recorded portions of the conversation, then manipulated the audio to change the context completely. With careful editing, "I'd rather have them than their money" could easily become, "I'm just waiting to inherit their money." Professional audio manipulation software was readily available, and selective editing could make anyone sound like anything. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't fabricated recordings from nothing. He'd taken my actual words and twisted them into their opposite meaning. It was sophisticated, evil, and probably undetectable to my parents, who had no reason to suspect such elaborate deception from their own son. But it was also potentially provable. If I could locate the original, unedited audio files on his devices, or if I could demonstrate the technical manipulation, the entire foundation of his case would crumble. I called Jennifer immediately to confirm my memory of our conversation. Her recollection matched mine perfectly, and she agreed to provide a sworn statement about the actual content and context of our discussion. But more importantly, she remembered Marcus being present during the call. "He was definitely in your kitchen," she confirmed. "I remember because you put me on speaker for a minute while you were making coffee, and he said hello. We talked for maybe 30 seconds about his new apartment search." The pieces were falling into place, but I needed more. I needed access to Marcus's devices or digital files, which would require either his cooperation or legal intervention. Since cooperation seemed unlikely, I began researching the legal options for challenging a will based on fraud and undue influence. The law was complex but encouraging. If I could prove that Marcus had deliberately deceived our parents with fabricated evidence, the will could be invalidated entirely. The burden of proof was high, but not insurmountable. I would need to demonstrate 3 things: that the recordings were manipulated, that Marcus knew they were false, and that our parents relied on this false evidence in making their decision. I had a plan for proving all 3 elements, but it would require patience, strategy, and probably a confrontation that would tear whatever remained of our family apart permanently. The question was whether exposing the truth was worth the cost of any remaining relationship with Marcus and potentially with my parents, if they chose to believe his lies even when faced with evidence of his deception. As I sat in my office that evening, surrounded by documents and timelines and legal research, I realized something had fundamentally changed in me.
The daughter who had prioritized family harmony above all else was gone, replaced by someone who valued truth more than peace. Marcus had tried to erase my identity and replace it with a fiction that served his purposes. In doing so, he'd created an enemy far more dangerous than the loving sister he'd betrayed. The war was far from over, but the battle lines were now clearly drawn. And unlike Marcus, I wouldn't need lies to win. The first step in my investigation required something I'd never imagined needing: professional espionage equipment. I contacted a private investigator named David Kim who specialized in corporate fraud cases. When I explained my situation, his expression shifted from polite interest to genuine concern. "Family cases are always the most vicious," he said, leaning back in his chair across from me in his downtown office. "People think they know their relatives, but money has a way of revealing who someone really is underneath all the pretense." David's office was a study in organized chaos, with filing cabinets lining every wall and multiple computer monitors displaying what looked like surveillance footage and data analysis programs. He'd been recommended by a colleague who'd used his services to investigate embezzlement at her firm, and his reputation for discretion was as important to me as his technical expertise. "The audio manipulation angle is definitely promising," he continued, pulling up a forensic software interface on his screen. "Modern editing programs leave digital fingerprints that experts can detect, but we'd need access to the original files or at least the devices used to create them. That's where things get legally complicated." I'd anticipated this challenge. What if the recordings were obtained through legitimate means? If I can demonstrate that I was recorded without consent in my own home, doesn't that create legal grounds for compelling production of the files? David nodded approvingly. "You're thinking like a lawyer. Yes, if we can establish that you were secretly recorded, that's potentially criminal, depending on your state's laws. But more importantly for your case, it would give us standing to request a court order for digital discovery." The plan we developed was methodical and legally sound. First, I would need to confirm my suspicions about when and how the recording took place. Then, we would need to establish a timeline that proved Marcus had both opportunity and motive. Finally, we would need expert analysis to demonstrate the technical manipulation. "There's one more element to consider," David added. "If your brother is sophisticated enough to manipulate audio files convincingly, he's probably smart enough to have destroyed the evidence by now. We might only get one chance at this, so we need to be prepared for him to deny everything and claim the recordings were lost or deleted." The weight of that possibility settled over me like a physical burden. If Marcus had covered his tracks completely, I might never be able to prove his deception. My parents would live the rest of their lives believing I had betrayed their trust, and Marcus would inherit everything based on lies. But David's next words gave me hope. "However, most people aren't as careful as they think they are. Digital files leave traces even when deleted. Cloud storage creates automatic backups, and even sophisticated liars make mistakes when they're confronted with specific evidence. The key is building enough circumstantial proof that the truth becomes undeniable." I left David's office with a detailed plan and a renewed sense of purpose. The little girl who had always tried to keep everyone happy was completely gone now, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the only way to preserve what matters is to fight for it without compromise. My first stop was Jennifer's office. As my law school classmate and current colleague, she had both the legal knowledge to understand what I was facing and the personal relationship to remember our conversation clearly. Her law firm occupied the 15th floor of a downtown building, and her corner office overlooked the city where I'd built my life and career. "Sophia, I've been thinking about this since your call," Jennifer said before I'd even settled into the chair across from her desk. "That conversation we had was so specific because it was right after I dealt with the Hendricks case. Remember the family where the son was trying to have his father declared incompetent so he could control the estate?" I did remember. The case had disturbed both of us because the elderly father was clearly competent but being systematically isolated and manipulated by his son. Jennifer had won the case, but the family had been destroyed in the process. "I remember you saying something about being grateful that your family wasn't like that," Jennifer continued. "You specifically mentioned that you'd rather have your parents healthy and present than worry about inheritance." I remember because it was such a contrast to what we'd been dealing with professionally. Jennifer pulled out a legal pad and began writing as she spoke. "I can give you the exact date of our conversation because it was the day after the Hendricks verdict, which is in court records. I can also confirm that your brother was present for at least part of the call because he answered when you went to get more coffee. The timeline was crucial. If I could establish exactly when Marcus was in my kitchen and correlate it with when he later claimed to have discovered my true feelings, it would demonstrate the calculated nature of his deception. There's something else, Jennifer added, looking up from her notes. Your brother asked me about the Hendricks case specifically. He wanted to know how someone could challenge a will based on manipulation. I thought it was just casual interest at the time, but now, the implications hit me like a lightning bolt. Marcus hadn't just stumbled upon an opportunity to record me. He'd been planning this manipulation for months, possibly longer. He'd used my own professional conversations to understand how to frame his deception in legal terms that would be convincing to our parents. Jennifer, would you be willing to testify about this if it comes to a legal challenge? Her response was immediate and firm. Absolutely. What your brother is doing is exactly the kind of manipulation we fought against in the Hendricks case.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I won't stand by and watch him destroy your family with lies. Armed with Jennifer's statement and timeline, my next step was more delicate. I needed to understand exactly what Marcus had told our parents and how he'd presented his evidence. This meant another conversation with them, but this time I would be gathering intelligence rather than simply reacting to their accusations. I called Mom that afternoon, keeping my voice carefully neutral. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I'd like to understand more about what Marcus showed you. I'm not trying to argue or change your minds, I just need to comprehend how this all happened. Mom's voice was strained when she answered, Sophia, I don't think rehashing the details will help anyone. Maybe not, but I need to understand for my own peace of mind. You mentioned recordings. How many were there? What did they supposedly capture? There was a long pause before Mom responded. 3 different conversations, Marcus said, all from around the same time period, about 3 months ago. He said you'd been talking to different people about us, about your plans. 3 recordings. That meant Marcus had either visited me multiple times during that period or had somehow captured multiple conversations during his single visit. I made a mental note to check my calendar and call logs for that time frame. What specifically did these recordings contain? I know this is difficult, but I need to understand what convinced you. Mom's voice grew smaller. Things about waiting for us to pass away so you could inherit. Comments about how we were becoming a burden, but you had to pretend to care to protect your financial interests. Discussions about how Marcus was too honest for his own good, while you knew how to manipulate situations to your advantage. Each accusation felt like a knife twisting in my chest, not because they were true, but because they were such perfect inversions of reality. Marcus had taken my genuine love and reframed it as calculation, my presence as manipulation, my concern as self-interest. Did Marcus play these recordings for you directly, or did he just describe them? Another pause. He played them, clear as day, your voice saying these things. That's why we couldn't doubt what we were hearing. The confirmation that actual audio existed was both devastating and hopeful. Devastating because it meant my parents had heard what they believed was my voice saying terrible things about them. Hopeful because audio files could be analyzed for manipulation. Mom, I need you to know that I never said those things. I never even thought them. But I also understand that if you heard what sounded like my voice saying them, you'd have no reason to doubt it was real. Sophia, Mom's voice trailed off, and I could hear the conflict in her tone. Part of her wanted to believe me, but the evidence she'd been presented with was compelling. I'm going to prove to you that those recordings were manipulated, I said quietly. I don't know yet how long it will take or what it will require, but I'm going to show you the truth about what really happened. After hanging up, I sat in my office staring at the timeline I'd been building. Marcus's deception was even more sophisticated than I'd initially realized. He hadn't just edited existing audio, he'd created an entire narrative across multiple fake conversations, each one designed to reinforce the others and build a comprehensive picture of me as a manipulative daughter. But sophistication could also mean vulnerability.
The more complex a lie becomes, the more opportunities there are for contradictions and evidence of fabrication. David had been right. I needed to think like both a lawyer and an investigator. My phone rang, interrupting my analysis. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the voice was familiar. Miss Chen, this is Eleanor Vasquez, the notary from your parents' will signing. I hope you don't mind me calling directly, but something's been bothering me since we spoke. Of course, Miss Vasquez. What's on your mind? I've been thinking about that day, and I remembered something that seemed odd at the time but makes more sense now. Your brother had his phone out during the waiting period, and he was showing your parents something on the screen. I couldn't see what it was, but your mother became visibly upset after viewing whatever he'd shown her. My pulse quickened. Did it seem like he was playing audio or video? Definitely audio. I could see your parents listening intently, and your mother put her hand to her mouth like she was shocked by what she was hearing. Your father's reaction was different. He looked angry rather than sad. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Marcus had used the audio files not just to convince our parents initially, but to reinforce his story right up until the moment they signed the new will. He'd made sure their minds were filled with the sound of my supposed betrayal as they made their decision. Miss Vasquez, would you be willing to provide a sworn statement about what you observed that day? I've already prepared one, she replied without hesitation. 20 years in this business, and I've never seen a family situation that felt more wrong. Whatever your brother played for your parents that day, it broke your mother's heart. I could see it in her face. That evening, I met with David again to review what we'd learned. His office was quieter now, most of the staff having gone home, but the computers continued their silent analysis of whatever cases he was working on. The good news is that we're building a strong circumstantial case, he said, reviewing my notes. The timeline, the witness statements, the notary's observations, it all points to systematic deception. The challenging part is still going to be proving the audio manipulation. David pulled up a chair next to his computer and opened what looked like a complex audio analysis program. Here's what we're dealing with technically. Modern voice manipulation software can create very convincing fake audio, but it almost always leaves traces that forensic analysis can detect. Things like frequency inconsistencies, background noise variations, and digital artifacts from the editing process. The screen displayed a waveform that meant nothing to me, but David pointed to various sections as he explained. The problem is that we need the original files to perform this analysis. Without them, we're limited to trying to prove fabrication through indirect means. What kind of indirect means? Demonstrating impossibilities in the alleged recordings. For example, if the audio contains background sounds that couldn't have existed when and where the conversation supposedly took place.
Or voices discussing events that hadn't happened yet at the time of the alleged recording. I thought about this approach. The conversation Jennifer remembered was specifically about the Hendricks case, which had a very specific timeline. If Marcus edited that audio to create something incriminating, there might be references that don't match the chronology. David nodded approvingly. Exactly. We need to create a detailed timeline of your actual activities and conversations during the period when these recordings were supposedly made. Then we need to identify any inconsistencies between what really happened and what the recordings claim happened. We spent the next 2 hours building a comprehensive timeline. I went through my calendar, call logs, email records, and bank statements for the 3-month period leading up to Marcus's accusation. What emerged was a picture of someone whose life was completely focused on family care and professional responsibilities. During the time when Marcus claimed I was secretly plotting to inherit my parents' money, the evidence showed me paying for their new water heater, driving Dad to physical therapy appointments, and coordinating with their doctors about Mom's medication adjustments. I'd also been working on pro bono cases for elderly clients, specifically helping seniors protect themselves from financial exploitation. The irony was so complete it was almost absurd. While Marcus was fabricating evidence that I was financially exploiting our parents, I was literally working for free to help other people's parents avoid exactly that kind of exploitation. This is powerful circumstantial evidence, David said, reviewing the timeline. But we need something more direct, something that proves Marcus had both the technical capability and the specific opportunity to create these recordings. That's when I remembered something that made my stomach drop. David, Marcus is a sound engineer. He works for a recording studio downtown. Audio manipulation isn't just something he could figure out, it's literally his profession. David looked up from his notes with raised eyebrows. You didn't mention that before. I honestly didn't think about it. He's always been so irresponsible that I never connected his technical skills with what he was doing to me. But he's been working with audio editing software for years. He'd know exactly how to manipulate recordings convincingly. The revelation changed everything. This wasn't a case of someone stumbling upon incriminating evidence, or even someone getting lucky with amateur manipulation. This was a professional using his specialized skills to systematically destroy his sister's relationship with their parents for financial gain. We need to research his employment history and technical capabilities, David said, already pulling up search engines on his computer. If we can demonstrate that he has professional-level audio editing skills, it destroys any claim that the recordings are genuine amateur captures of real conversations. Within an hour, we had pulled Marcus's professional profile from multiple sources. His LinkedIn showed 5 years of experience as a sound engineer at premier recording studios. His portfolio included work on commercial voiceovers, podcast production, and audio restoration projects. He'd even taken specialized courses in digital audio forensics, supposedly to detect and prevent the kind of manipulation he was now using against me. This is almost too perfect, David muttered, scrolling through Marcus's professional accomplishments. Your brother isn't just capable of creating convincing fake audio, he's specifically trained in techniques used to make manipulation undetectable. The more we learned about Marcus's professional background, the more his deception revealed itself as a calculated attack rather than a spontaneous accusation. He'd used his technical expertise, his knowledge of my daily routines, and his understanding of our parents' fears to create a perfect storm of false evidence. But his expertise might also be his downfall. David, if Marcus is professionally trained in audio forensics, wouldn't he know that even sophisticated manipulation leaves traces? Wouldn't he have been more careful? David smiled grimly. That's the thing about people who think they're smarter than everyone else. They get overconfident. Plus, he probably never expected you to fight back this systematically. Most people in your situation would either accept the family's decision or fight it emotionally rather than methodically. He was right. The old Sophia, the peacekeeper who prioritized family harmony above all else, would have been devastated but ultimately accepting. She would have tried to repair the relationship through apologies and demonstrations of love, never suspecting that the damage was based on fabricated evidence. But Marcus had made a crucial error in his character assessment. By attacking my integrity so completely, he'd eliminated the person who might have chosen family peace over personal vindication. The woman who emerged from that betrayal was someone who valued truth more than relationships, justice more than harmony. So what's our next move? I asked. David leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. We need to get Marcus to reveal more details about his evidence. The more specific he gets, the more opportunities we'll have to identify inconsistencies and impossibilities. But we need to be careful. If he realizes we're building a case against him, he'll become more cautious. What do you suggest? I think it's time for you to have another conversation with your brother. But this time, you're not going to challenge him directly. You're going to seem defeated, maybe even grateful that the truth came out. You're going to ask him to help you understand what you did wrong, so you can work on becoming a better person. The suggestion made me physically nauseous. The idea of pretending gratitude to Marcus for destroying my relationship with our parents was almost impossible to contemplate. But I understood the strategy. If Marcus believed he'd won completely, he might become careless with details that could expose his deception. Can you do it? David asked, reading my expression accurately. I know it's asking a lot, but it might be our best chance to get him to reveal something we can use. I thought about my parents, probably sitting in their house right now, believing their daughter had been manipulating them for years. I thought about the hurt in Mom's voice when she described hearing what she believed were my words betraying her trust. I thought about the will that would give everything to the son who had orchestrated this entire deception. Yes, I said finally. I can do it, but only because every lie he tells me is another piece of evidence we can use to destroy his story. David nodded approvingly. Remember, the goal isn't to gather evidence for a confrontation. It's to gather evidence for a legal challenge. Everything he tells you needs to be documented and verified. We're building a case that will hold up in court, not just in a family argument. The distinction was important. This wasn't about proving to Marcus that I knew he was lying. It was about proving to a judge that the will had been procured through fraud. That required a different kind of evidence and a different level of proof. As I drove home that night, I practiced the conversation I would have with Marcus. I needed to sound broken but not bitter, confused but not suspicious, grateful but not sarcastic. It would be the performance of my life, and the stakes couldn't be higher. But underneath the strategy and planning, a cold anger was building that I'd never experienced before. Marcus had stolen more than money or property. He'd stolen my parents' love and trust. He'd rewritten the story of our family, casting himself as the hero and me as the villain. The old Sophia might have eventually forgiven that betrayal for the sake of family unity.
But the new Sophia, the one forged in the fire of systematic deception, had only one goal: ensuring that truth prevailed, no matter what it cost. Tomorrow, I would begin the most difficult conversation of my life, but tonight, I would prepare for war with the methodical precision of someone who finally understood that some battles are worth fighting, even if you have to destroy everything to win them. The phone call to Marcus required more preparation than any legal argument I'd ever made. I spent an hour practicing my tone in front of the mirror, perfecting the right mixture of defeat and confusion that would encourage him to explain his evidence in detail. The hardest part was suppressing the rage that burned in my chest every time I thought about his systematic manipulation of our parents. I called him at 10 in the morning, knowing he typically worked late shifts at the recording studio and would likely be home. His voice was cautious when he answered, as if he was trying to gauge my emotional state from my greeting. "Marcus, I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and I need to understand what I did wrong," I began, injecting a tremor into my voice that wasn't entirely manufactured. "I've been replaying every conversation I've had about Mom and Dad, and I honestly can't remember saying the things they described. I'm wondering if maybe I said things that came across differently than I intended." There was a pause before Marcus responded, and I could almost hear him recalibrating his approach. "Sophia, I know this is hard for you to accept. Sometimes people say things they don't even realize they're saying, especially when they think they're in a safe space. Can you help me understand when this happened? Mon mentioned 3 different recordings, but I'm having trouble placing when those conversations would have occurred." Marcus's voice took on a patient, almost condescending tone that made my skin crawl. "They were all from that period in March when you were stressed about work. You know how you get when you're under pressure. Sometimes your filter comes down and you say things you might not normally express." March? That was exactly when Jennifer and I had discussed the Hendricks case, and when Marcus had visited my house unexpectedly. The timeline was confirming my suspicions perfectly. "I remember that time," I said carefully. "I was working on some difficult cases. But who was I supposedly talking to in these recordings? Maybe if I could contact them, we could figure out what happened." Another pause, longer this time. "That's part of what made it so concerning, Sophia. You were having these conversations with people I didn't recognize. It seemed like you were being very careful about who you shared these feelings with." The lie was smooth and practiced, but it revealed a crucial weakness in Marcus's story. He couldn't identify specific people I'd supposedly spoken to because the conversations had never actually happened. He'd created audio that sounded like me talking to unnamed individuals, probably by editing together pieces of real conversations and adding fictional responses. "I'm so confused," I continued, letting genuine emotion creep into my voice. "The things Mom described sound so unlike me. About waiting for them to die, about pretending to care. I can't imagine ever feeling that way, let alone saying it out loud." "People are complex, Sophia. You've always been very controlled, very careful about your image. Maybe these recordings just captured a side of yourself you've been hiding, even from yourself.
The psychological manipulation in his response was almost as sophisticated as the technical deception. Marcus was suggesting that my own memory and self-awareness were unreliable, that his fabricated evidence revealed hidden truths about my character. It was a textbook example of gaslighting, designed to make me doubt my own reality. The recording quality must have been very good for Mom and Dad to be so convinced, I said, fishing for technical details. Actually, that's one of the things that made it so damning. The audio was crystal clear, much better quality than you'd expect from a casual recording. It was like you were speaking directly into a microphone. My heart raced at this admission. Marcus had just revealed that the audio quality was inconsistent with secretly recorded conversations. If someone had been surreptitiously recording me during casual conversations, the audio would be muffled, distant, and full of background noise. Crystal clear quality suggested professional recording equipment and controlled conditions. Where did these recordings come from? I mean, how did you happen to capture them? Marcus's hesitation was subtle but noticeable. I'd rather not get into the specifics of how I obtained them. What matters is that they revealed your true feelings about our family. The evasion was telling. If the recordings were genuine evidence of my betrayal, Marcus would have no reason to be secretive about how he'd obtained them. His reluctance to provide details suggested he couldn't explain the circumstances without revealing the fabrication. I understand, I said, though understanding was the last thing I felt. I guess I'm just trying to figure out how to move forward from here. Do you think there's any way to repair my relationship with Mom and Dad? Time heals everything, Marcus replied, his voice taking on a magnanimous tone that made me want to scream. Once they've processed this betrayal, maybe they'll be open to rebuilding trust. But you'll need to prove that you've changed, that you understand how your actions affected them. The casual cruelty of his suggestion that I needed to apologize for betrayals I'd never committed was breathtaking. Marcus had so thoroughly convinced himself of his own narrative that he genuinely seemed to believe I should be grateful for his truth-telling. What do you think I should do to prove I've changed? Start by accepting responsibility instead of trying to deny what happened. Mom and Dad heard your voice saying these things, Sophia. Continuing to claim innocence just makes you look more manipulative. And there it was, the perfect logical trap. Deny the fabricated evidence, and you're manipulative. Accept it, and you're admitting to betrayals you never committed. Marcus had created a scenario where my only options were self-destruction or accepting his version of reality. But he'd made one crucial error in his psychological manipulation. By insisting that I accept responsibility for actions I'd never taken, he'd revealed that his entire strategy depended on my compliance. If I refused to play by his rules, if I continued to seek the truth regardless of family consequences, his carefully constructed narrative would begin to unravel. You're right, I said, forcing the words through gritted teeth. I need to focus on taking responsibility rather than trying to defend myself. Thank you for being patient with me while I work through this. Of course, Marcus replied, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. That's what family does. We help each other become better people. The hypocrisy was so complete, it was almost artistic. Marcus had systematically destroyed our family relationships for personal gain, then positioned himself as the moral authority helping me become a better person. It was manipulation so sophisticated it bordered on sociopathic. After ending the call, I immediately documented every detail of our conversation in a secure file on my computer. Marcus's admissions about audio quality, his evasiveness about recording circumstances, and his inability to identify specific conversation partners were all valuable pieces of evidence. But more importantly, I now understood the full scope of his deception. This wasn't just about fabricated audio. It was about creating an entire alternative reality where my love was manipulation, my presence was calculation, and my care was self-interest. Marcus had essentially performed psychological surgery on our family, removing me from their emotional landscape and replacing me with a fictional villain. The realization was devastating, but also liberating. For months, I'd been questioning my own memory and motivations, wondering if there was some truth to Marcus's accusations that I'd been unconsciously manipulative. Now I understood that the confusion and self-doubt were exactly what he'd intended to create. My phone buzzed with a text message from David. How did it go? Any useful admissions? I called him immediately and recounted the conversation in detail. His reactions to Marcus's statements confirmed my analysis. Every evasion and inconsistency was potential evidence of fabrication. The audio quality admission is huge, David said. Professional quality recordings of allegedly secret conversations? That's almost impossible to explain legitimately. Plus, his refusal to identify conversation partners suggests he can't because they don't exist. What's our next step? We need to start building the technical case. I've arranged for you to meet with Dr. Sarah Martinez, one of the best audio forensics experts in the state. She specializes in detecting digital manipulation, and she's testified in dozens of cases involving fabricated evidence. The appointment was scheduled for the following afternoon at Dr. Martinez's laboratory, a facility that looked more like a high-tech recording studio than a traditional forensics lab. Dr. Martinez herself was a small woman with graying hair and intense eyes that seemed to look right through me when we met. David explained your situation, she said without preamble. Family manipulation cases are among the most challenging we handle because the emotional stakes are so high. But they're also cases where the truth usually reveals itself through technical analysis. Dr. Martinez led me to a workstation dominated by multiple monitors, displaying complex waveform patterns and frequency analyses. Even the most sophisticated audio manipulation leaves traces, she explained. Digital editing creates artifacts, tiny inconsistencies in background noise, frequency patterns, and temporal relationships that trained analysts can detect. But we don't have access to the actual recordings, I pointed out. True, but we can still build a strong case through other means. First, we'll analyze your brother's technical capabilities and typical workflow patterns. Second, we'll examine any audio samples we can legitimately obtain from your actual conversations. Third, we'll identify technical impossibilities in the alleged recordings based on the descriptions you've gathered. Dr. Martinez pulled up what looked like a professional audio editing interface. Your brother works at Premier Recording Studios, correct? I'm familiar with their equipment and software packages. They use industry-standard manipulation tools that would be more than sufficient to create convincing fake audio. She began demonstrating how modern audio editing software could seamlessly combine different conversation fragments, adjust timing and pitch, and even simulate different acoustic environments. The technology was far more sophisticated than I'd realized, capable of creating audio that would be nearly impossible for untrained listeners to identify as manipulated. However, Dr. Martinez continued, this sophistication works both ways. The more advanced the manipulation, the more digital artifacts it creates. Professional editing leaves professional-level evidence of tampering. She showed me examples from previous cases where fabricated audio had been exposed through technical analysis. In each case, the deception had seemed perfect to family members and even law enforcement, but forensic examination had revealed clear evidence of manipulation. The key is getting access to the source files or the devices used to create them, Dr. Martinez explained. Without that access, we're limited to building circumstantial technical evidence. What would we need to compel that kind of access legally? A court order based on probable cause that the recordings were fabricated. That requires enough preliminary evidence to convince a judge that digital discovery is warranted. I thought about everything we'd gathered so far. The timeline inconsistencies, Marcus's professional capabilities, his evasive responses about recording circumstances, and the technical impossibilities in his story. It was substantial circumstantial evidence, but would it be enough for a court order? Dr. Martinez, if you could examine the actual recordings, how long would it take to determine if they were manipulated? With professional-level fabrication, probably several days of detailed analysis. But I'd be able to provide preliminary findings within hours. The question is whether we can create enough legal pressure to force production of the files. That evening, I met with my attorney, Rebecca Walsh, who specialized in estate litigation. Rebecca's office was elegant and understated, filled with law books and case files that spoke to decades of experience in family disputes. She'd been recommended by several colleagues as someone who combined legal expertise with genuine empathy for clients dealing with family betrayal. I've reviewed everything you've provided, Rebecca said, gesturing to a thick file on her desk. You have the foundation for a strong challenge to the will based on fraud and undue influence. The question is whether we can gather enough evidence to prove your case before your parents pass away. The timeline consideration was sobering. Mom was 73 and Dad was 76, both in reasonably good health but not young. If this legal battle dragged on for years, I might win the case but lose any chance of reconciliation with my parents while they were still alive. What's the fastest path to resolution? I asked. Emergency relief. If we can demonstrate immediate and irreparable harm, we can request expedited proceedings and temporary restraining orders. But that requires showing that your brother is actively continuing to manipulate the situation or that there's risk of evidence destruction. I thought about Marcus's access to our parents, his technical expertise, and his clear financial motivation to maintain his deception. How do we prove ongoing manipulation? We need evidence that he's continuing to influence your parents' decisions or that he's destroying evidence of his fraud. The challenge is gathering that evidence without violating privacy laws or engaging in behavior that could undermine our case. Rebecca opened a legal pad and began outlining our strategy. First, we'll file a formal challenge to the will based on the evidence we have. Second, we'll request expedited discovery, including forensic examination of any devices your brother used to create the alleged recordings. Third, we'll seek temporary injunctive relief to prevent any further manipulation of your parents or destruction of evidence. What are our chances of success? Rebecca's expression was thoughtful but cautious. The legal standard for proving fraud is high, but your case has several strong elements. The timeline inconsistencies, your brother's technical capabilities, and the witness statements about the will signing all support your claims. The wild card is whether we can get access to technical evidence that proves the recordings were fabricated. As we discussed the legal strategy, I realized that this case would ultimately come down to a simple question. Would a judge believe that a son was capable of systematically deceiving his elderly parents with fabricated evidence to steal his sister's inheritance? The cynical part of me knew that such deception was not only possible, but probably more common than most people realized. The hopeful part of me believed that truth would ultimately prevail if we presented it clearly and convincingly. Rebecca, what happens if we prove that Marcus fabricated the recordings, but my parents still choose to believe his story? Her expression grew somber. That's the hardest part of family litigation. We can prove fraud and invalidate the will, but we can't force family reconciliation. Your parents might always wonder if there was some truth to your brother's accusations, even if we prove they were based on fabricated evidence. The possibility that I might win the legal battle but lose my family permanently was devastating to consider. But the alternative, allowing Marcus's deception to stand unchallenged, was even worse.
At least fighting for the truth would preserve my integrity, even if it couldn't restore my relationships. I need to do this, I told Rebecca, not just for the inheritance, but because allowing lies to define our family's truth would be a betrayal of everything my parents taught me about right and wrong. Rebecca nodded approvingly. That's exactly the motivation that wins these cases. Judges can usually tell the difference between someone fighting for money and someone fighting for justice. As I left Rebecca's office that evening, I felt the weight of the decision I'd made. In choosing to challenge Marcus's deception through legal action, I was crossing a line that would make family reconciliation infinitely more difficult. But in allowing his lies to stand unchallenged, I would be betraying not only myself, but also the values my parents had instilled in me throughout my childhood. The war was escalating beyond family arguments and emotional manipulation into the realm of legal combat. Marcus had chosen the weapons when he decided to use fabricated evidence to destroy my relationship with our parents. Now I was choosing the battlefield, where truth would be determined by evidence and law rather than by manipulation and lies. Tomorrow, Rebecca would begin filing the legal documents that would formally challenge Marcus's deception. Within days, he would discover that his carefully constructed narrative was under systematic attack by people who understood both his technical capabilities and his emotional manipulations. The old Sophia had been destroyed by his betrayal, but the woman who emerged from that destruction was someone Marcus had never encountered before, someone who valued truth more than peace, justice more than relationships, and her own integrity more than family approval. The real battle was just beginning, and this time, Marcus would discover what happened when someone fought back with the same level of sophistication and determination he'd used to attack them. But unlike Marcus, I wouldn't need to fabricate evidence to prove my case. The truth, properly presented and expertly analyzed, would be more than sufficient to destroy his lies and expose the calculating manipulation that had torn our family apart. The question was no longer whether I could prove Marcus's deception, it was whether my parents would be able to accept the truth about their son when it was finally revealed in all its devastating detail.
The legal papers were filed on a crisp Thursday morning in October, and by noon, Marcus had been served with notice that his carefully constructed world was about to crumble. Rebecca had warned me that his reaction would be swift and probably vicious, but I wasn't prepared for the phone call that came at 2 in the afternoon. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Marcus's voice was pure rage, stripped of all pretense of brotherly concern. "You're actually going to drag our family through court because you can't accept that Mom and Dad finally saw through your manipulation?" I had prepared for this moment, practicing responses that would document his admissions while avoiding any statements that could be used against me later. "I'm challenging a will that was procured through fraudulent evidence, Marcus. If the recordings you provided are genuine, you have nothing to worry about." "Those recordings are you, Sophia, your voice, saying exactly what I told them you said. You can hire all the lawyers you want, but you can't change reality." The confidence in his voice was telling. Marcus genuinely believed that his technical skills were sufficient to withstand professional forensic analysis. His arrogance would be his downfall, but first, I needed him to provide more details that would help our case. "If the recordings are real, then you should welcome the opportunity to have them authenticated by experts. Professional analysis will only confirm their validity." There was a pause that lasted several seconds too long. "I don't have to prove anything to you, Sophia. Mom and Dad heard what they heard, and that's all that matters. Actually, under court order, you'll be required to produce the original files for forensic examination. Modern audio analysis can detect even sophisticated manipulation. So, if the recordings are genuine, the science will support your claims." The silence stretched even longer this time. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had lost some of its aggressive confidence. "You're destroying our family over money, Sophia. Is that really who you want to be?" The projection was perfect, accusing me of the exact behavior he'd exhibited while positioning himself as the protector of family unity. But his deflection also revealed something crucial. He was afraid of forensic analysis. "I'm fighting for the truth, Marcus. If that destroys our family, it's because our family was built on lies." The call ended abruptly, but within an hour, I received 3 more calls, one each from Mom and Dad, and one from a number I didn't recognize. I let them all go to voicemail, knowing that any direct communication needed to be carefully controlled and documented. Mom's message was heartbreaking. "Sophia, please don't do this. We're your parents, and we love you, but we can't ignore what we heard. This legal action is just proving that Marcus was right about your priorities." Dad's message was angry. "I'm disappointed in you, Sophia. We raised you better than this. Attacking your own family in court over money shows exactly the kind of person you've become." The third message was from a lawyer representing Marcus, informing me that any further contact with my parents should go through legal counsel, and warning that continued harassment of elderly clients would result in protective orders. The speed with which Marcus had lawyered up told me everything I needed to know about his confidence in his fabricated evidence. Innocent people don't immediately hire attorneys and try to cut off communication when challenged. They welcome investigation because they have nothing to hide. Rebecca called that evening with updates on our legal strategy. "The court has agreed to expedited proceedings given the ages of your parents and the nature of the fraud allegations. We'll have a preliminary hearing in 2 weeks where we'll request court-ordered discovery, including forensic examination of your brother's devices." "What are our chances of getting the discovery order?" "Better than I initially expected. Your brother's immediate hiring of counsel and attempts to limit communication actually support our argument that he's trying to hide evidence. The judge will want to see the underlying evidence before making any determinations about the will's validity." Rebecca paused before continuing. "There's something else you should know. My investigator ran a financial background check on your brother as part of our case preparation. His debt situation is even worse than we thought. He's facing potential bankruptcy, and there are liens against his current assets. The timing of the will change becomes much more significant when viewed against his financial desperation." The financial timeline created a compelling narrative. Marcus hadn't just opportunistically seized on a chance to manipulate our parents. He'd systematically planned his deception as a solution to his financial crisis. The sophistication of his approach made perfect sense when viewed as a deliberate strategy rather than spontaneous family manipulation. "We're also going to subpoena records from his employer," Rebecca continued. If he used professional equipment to create the fabricated audio, there should be digital logs and usage records that will support our case. The noose was tightening around Marcus's deception, but I knew he wouldn't surrender without escalating his attacks. People capable of the kind of systematic manipulation he demonstrated don't typically accept defeat gracefully. I didn't have to wait long to discover his next strategy. The following morning, I found a letter in my mailbox that hadn't come through postal delivery. It was handwritten on expensive stationery, and the return address showed my parents' home. Sophia, the letter began in Mom's familiar handwriting. We've been thinking about your legal action, and we want you to know that it's causing us tremendous pain. We're elderly, and the stress of family conflict is affecting our health. We're asking you, as our daughter, to please stop this legal attack on your brother and our family. We heard what we heard, and no court proceeding will change that. If you continue with this lawsuit, we'll have no choice but to cut off all contact with you permanently. We love you, but we can't allow you to destroy our peace in our final years. Please choose family over money. Please choose love over litigation. The letter was masterfully crafted emotional manipulation, designed to make me appear heartless for pursuing legal remedies against obvious fraud. But it was also evidence of Marcus's continued influence over our parents and his willingness to use their emotional welfare as a weapon against me.
I photographed the letter and immediately forwarded it to Rebecca with a note about the unusual delivery method. Her response was swift and legally significant. This letter actually helps our case. It demonstrates ongoing manipulation and suggests coordination between your brother and your parents that goes beyond normal family communication. The fact that it was hand-delivered rather than mailed suggests deliberate avoidance of documentation. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in a courthouse I'd visited countless times for professional reasons, but never as a personal litigant. The difference in perspective was jarring. Instead of representing clients, I was the client, watching my entire family history be reduced to legal arguments and evidence exhibits. Marcus arrived with 2 attorneys, a fact that immediately caught the judge's attention. Most inheritance disputes involved family members with minimal legal representation, not siblings bringing entire legal teams to preliminary hearings. Your Honor, Rebecca began, we're requesting emergency discovery in this matter because the respondent has used his professional audio engineering skills to create fabricated evidence that deceived elderly parents into changing their will. The sophistication of this deception requires immediate forensic examination before evidence can be destroyed. Marcus's lead attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Harrison Webb, responded immediately. These are baseless accusations from a disgruntled family member who can't accept that her parents discovered her true character. The audio recordings in question are genuine documentation of the petitioner's own words, and this legal action is simply an extension of the manipulative behavior those recordings revealed. Judge Patricia Hendricks, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and penetrating eyes, studied the documents before responding. Mr. Webb, your client is professionally trained in audio manipulation, correct? He works in the recording industry, Your Honor, but that doesn't make him guilty of fabricating evidence. No, but it does make him uniquely capable of such fabrication, Judge Hendricks replied dryly. Ms. Walsh, what specific evidence are you requesting permission to examine? Rebecca stood and handed a prepared list to the bailiff. We're requesting forensic examination of all digital devices belonging to the respondent, including computers, phones, and professional recording equipment. We're also requesting production of the original audio files that formed the basis of the will change, along with any backup files, project files, or metadata associated with those recordings. The judge reviewed the list carefully before turning to Marcus's attorney. Mr. Webb, does your client have any objection to producing the original audio files for independent forensic examination? The pause that followed was telling. If the recordings were genuine, there would be no reason to resist professional authentication. But Harrison Webb's expression suggested he was trying to find legal grounds to avoid production. Your Honor, these files contain private family conversations. Requiring their production violates my client's privacy rights and could set a dangerous precedent for family communications. Judge Hendricks raised an eyebrow. Mr. Webb, your client used these alleged private conversations to convince elderly parents to disinherit their daughter.
He forfeited any privacy claims when he made those recordings the basis of legal and financial decisions. Furthermore, if the recordings are genuine, forensic examination will only confirm their authenticity. The judge's reasoning was exactly what Rebecca had predicted. Courts were generally unsympathetic to privacy claims when the evidence in question had already been used to influence legal decisions. "I'm granting the petitioner's request for expedited discovery," Judge Hendricks announced. "The respondent will produce all requested digital files within 72 hours. I'm also appointing Dr. Sarah Martinez as the court's independent forensic expert. Her analysis will determine whether these recordings show evidence of manipulation." Marcus's face went pale at the mention of Dr. Martinez's name. Either he recognized her reputation in the field, or he understood that professional forensic examination would expose his deception. The hearing concluded with a schedule for full proceedings in 30 days, contingent on the results of the forensic analysis. As we left the courtroom, I could hear Marcus arguing intensely with his attorneys in the hallway, his voice carrying a desperation that hadn't been present during the hearing. Dr. Martinez called me that Friday afternoon with preliminary results that confirmed everything we'd suspected. "Sophia, I've never seen such sophisticated manipulation combined with such obvious evidence of fabrication. Your brother is clearly skilled at audio editing, but he made several crucial mistakes that expose the deception." "What kind of mistakes?" "First, the background acoustic environments are inconsistent within individual recordings. He pieced together fragments from different locations and times, but didn't properly match the ambient sound characteristics. Second, there are digital artifacts from multiple editing sessions that show the files were constructed rather than captured in real time. Third, and most damning, several of the alleged conversation fragments contain words that show evidence of pitch manipulation, your voice saying things but altered to change the emotional context. Dr. Martinez explained that Marcus had essentially created a sophisticated audio collage, taking real words and phrases from legitimate conversations and rearranging them to create entirely different meanings. The technical skill required was considerable, but the digital evidence of manipulation was unmistakable to professional analysis. "How certain are you of these findings?" "Absolutely certain. I'll be able to demonstrate the manipulation techniques in court using visual analysis that will be clear to a jury. Your brother created convincing fake audio, but he left digital fingerprints throughout the process." The forensic evidence was devastating to Marcus's case, but I knew the real test would be how our parents responded when confronted with proof that they'd been deceived. Dr. Martinez's findings could invalidate the will, but they couldn't automatically restore family relationships damaged by months of believing fabricated evidence. Rebecca filed a motion for summary judgment based on the forensic findings, arguing that the evidence of fraud was so clear that no trial was necessary. Marcus's attorneys requested additional time to find their own forensic expert, but they were fighting an uphill battle against scientific evidence. The motion hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and this time, Mom and Dad were present in the courtroom. They sat behind Marcus's legal team, looking fragile and confused in the formal legal environment. It was the first time I'd seen them since learning about the will change, and the emotional impact was overwhelming. Dr. Martinez testified about her findings with clinical precision, using visual displays to show the digital artifacts that proved manipulation. She played original audio fragments next to the manipulated versions, demonstrating how Marcus had taken real words and rearranged them to create false conversations. The most powerful moment came when Dr. Martinez played the original conversation with Jennifer about the Hendricks case, followed by Marcus's edited version that made it sound like I was discussing my own plans to manipulate our parents. The difference was stark and undeniable. The same words, but completely different meanings created through careful editing and context manipulation. I watched my parents' faces during this demonstration, seeing confusion give way to horror as they realized the extent to which they'd been deceived. Mom's hand bent to her mouth when she heard the original conversation, understanding for the first time that her son had systematically lied to her about my character and motivations. Marcus's forensic expert, Dr. Robert Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, attempted to argue that the artifacts Dr. Martinez had identified could have natural explanations. But under cross-examination by Rebecca, he was forced to admit that the combination of evidence she documented was consistent with deliberate manipulation rather than natural recording anomalies. Judge Patricia Hendricks took less than 10 minutes to reach her decision. Based on the clear and convincing forensic evidence presented, I find that the audio recordings used to influence the testator's decision were deliberately fabricated through sophisticated digital manipulation. The will dated 6 months ago is hereby invalidated due to fraud and undue influence. The previous will remains in effect as the valid expression of the testator's intentions. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Mom quietly crying. Dad sat stone-faced, staring at Marcus with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of betrayal, anger, and profound disappointment. Marcus stood abruptly and left the courtroom without speaking to anyone, his attorneys trailing behind with expressions that suggested they'd known this outcome was inevitable once the forensic evidence was presented. I approached my parents carefully, unsure of how they would react to seeing me after months of believing I had betrayed their trust. Mom looked up at me with tears streaming down her face, and for a moment I thought she might turn away.
Instead, she reached for my hand. Sophia, I'm so sorry. We should have known better. We should have trusted what we'd seen with our own eyes all these years, instead of believing. Her voice trailed off as the magnitude of Marcus's deception fully hit her. Dad's reaction was more complex. I don't understand how he could do this to us, to you. How he could make us believe such terrible things about our own daughter. The pain in his voice was devastating, but underneath it was a growing anger at being manipulated so completely. He needed money, I said simply, and he was willing to destroy our family to get it. The aftermath of the court victory was more complicated than I'd anticipated. While the legal vindication was complete, the emotional damage couldn't be undone by judicial decree. My parents were struggling with the knowledge that their son had systematically deceived them, while I was grappling with the reality that my brother had been willing to destroy my relationship with them for financial gain. The restored will meant that I would inherit equally with Marcus, assuming he remained in the will at all. But more importantly, it meant that my parents finally understood the truth about what had happened to our family. In the weeks that followed, Mom and Dad gradually began to process the full scope of Marcus's manipulation. They'd given him money for emergencies throughout his adult life, believing they were helping a son who was occasionally irresponsible but fundamentally honest. Learning that he'd fabricated evidence to destroy his sister's reputation was a betrayal that fundamentally changed their understanding of who he was as a person. Marcus disappeared from our lives entirely after the court ruling. His phone was disconnected, his apartment was vacated, and even his employer at the recording studio said he'd quit without notice. Whether he'd left town permanently or was simply avoiding the consequences of his actions, none of us knew. The money from the will was no longer the point. What mattered was that my parents could see clearly again, understanding that my years of care and presence had been genuine expressions of love rather than calculated manipulation. The recordings had been so convincing, and Marcus's presentation so persuasive, that they'd briefly lost sight of the evidence of their own experiences. One evening, about a month after the court ruling, I was having dinner with my parents when Dad brought up the subject that had been weighing on all of us. I keep thinking about how we failed you, Sophia, not just by believing Marcus's lies, but by not trusting our own knowledge of who you are. We watched you sacrifice for this family your entire adult life, and we let fabricated audio recordings convince us that none of it was real. You didn't fail me, I replied, though part of me wasn't entirely convinced of that. Marcus is a professional audio engineer who used his skills to create evidence that would have fooled anyone. The recordings sounded like my voice because they were my voice, just edited to say things I never said. Mom reached across the table to take my hand. But we should have questioned it more. We should have asked you directly, instead of letting Marcus convince us that confronting you would just lead to more lies. The conversation was healing but painful. My parents were trying to process their guilt over being deceived, while I was trying to forgive both their temporary loss of faith in me and Marcus's systematic destruction of our family trust. What happens now? Dad asked. Do we try to find Marcus? Do we attempt to repair that relationship too? It was a question I'd been dreading. Part of me wanted to say that Marcus deserved permanent exile from our family after what he'd done. But another part recognized that he was still their son, and they would have to find their own way to process his betrayal. That's not my decision to make, I said finally.
But if he does come back, it should be with a full acknowledgement of what he did and a genuine commitment to making amends, not just to me, but to both of you for manipulating and deceiving you so completely. The legal victory had restored my inheritance and vindicated my character, but it couldn't undo the months of believing I'd betrayed my parents' trust. Those memories would always be part of our family history, a reminder of how fragile trust can be and how sophisticated deception can temporarily overcome years of genuine relationship. In the end, Marcus's attempt to steal my inheritance had revealed something more valuable than money. It had shown me exactly how much my parents' love and trust meant to me, and it had proven that truth, properly defended, could overcome even the most sophisticated lies. The young woman who had prioritized family harmony above all else was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real love sometimes requires fighting for what matters most. Marcus had tried to destroy my place in our family, but instead, he'd shown me how strong that place actually was. 6 months later, I received a letter from Marcus with no return address, postmarked from a city across the country. It was brief and formal, acknowledging that he'd made mistakes in his desperation and expressing hope that someday we could move past this difficult time. The letter contained no real apology, no acknowledgement of the systematic nature of his deception, and no recognition of the damage he'd caused to our family relationships. It read like something written by his attorney rather than a genuine expression of remorse. I showed the letter to my parents, and we discussed whether to respond. In the end, we decided that any reconciliation would require Marcus to take full responsibility for his actions and demonstrate genuine change in his character. A vague letter about mistakes didn't meet that standard. The inheritance that Marcus had tried to steal through deception ultimately became the foundation for something positive. I used my portion to establish a legal aid fund for elderly clients dealing with family financial manipulation, working with other attorneys to help families facing the kind of systematic deception we'd experienced. The work was personally meaningful and professionally fulfilling, representing families where someone was trying to exploit elderly relatives through lies, manipulation, or fraud. In case after case, I saw variations of what Marcus had done to us. Family members using technical skills, emotional manipulation, or sophisticated lies to steal from relatives who trusted them. Every case I won felt like another victory over the mindset that had driven Marcus to betray our family. Every elderly client who was protected from financial exploitation was a small redemption of the pain we'd experienced. My relationship with my parents grew stronger than it had ever been, built now on a foundation of tested trust rather than assumed understanding. We'd been through the worst kind of family crisis and emerged with clarity about what really mattered: presence, truth, and genuine care rather than financial considerations. The experience had changed all of us. My parents were more cautious about accepting claims without verification, having learned that even family members can be sophisticated manipulators. I was more willing to fight for what mattered rather than prioritizing peace at any cost. But perhaps the most important change was our shared understanding that love isn't just about being there for the good times. It's about standing up for truth and justice, even when it's difficult, even when it requires legal action, even when it temporarily destroys family harmony. Marcus had tried to teach us that love was conditional, that it could be withdrawn when someone believed you'd betrayed them. Instead, he'd proven that real love is strong enough to survive deception, patient enough to seek truth, and brave enough to fight for what's right. The will that had tried to divide us had ultimately brought us closer together, and the son who had attempted to steal his sister's inheritance had ended up teaching his family the true value of trust, honesty, and unconditional love. In the end, Marcus got exactly what he deserved: nothing. Not because he was written out of a will, but because he'd chosen temporary financial gain over permanent family relationships. The war was over, truth had prevailed, and the family that remained was stronger for having been tested in the fire of sophisticated deception and systematic betrayal. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.